Hi, I'm Dr. Lloyd White, and this little video is introducing you to the joints of the shoulder complex, the structures that contribute to the joints and the type of joints that we have which allow us to perform the wide range of motion that we have at our shoulder. So here's a basic schematic diagram of the upper limb and the pectoral girdle on the shoulder. We have the rib cage and the sternum. We then have the clavicle articulating with the sternum. Clavicle goes across and articulates with the acromion process of the scapula, which forms the point of the shoulder. We have a couple of ligaments attaching the clavicle to the scapula, and then we have the head of the humerus articulating with the glenoid fossa on the lateral aspect of the scapula. So in terms of which joints we have, and we have 3 histological joints and 1 functional. We have the sternoclavicular joint attaching the clavicle to the sternum. We have the acromioclavicular joint attaching the clavicle to the acromion process. And we have the glenohumeral joint attaching the head of the humerus to the glenoid fossa of the scapula. Now there's another joint in inverted commas here, and it is our purely functional joint, the scapulothoracic joint. Now this joint is seen as the movement of the scapula against the thorax or against the rib cage. So as you move your pectoral girdle, you can then feel the scapula gliding over the thorax, and this is what we refer to as the scapulothoracic joint. And all the scapulothoracic joint is a combination of the movements that are actually occurring at the sternoclavicular joint and the acromioclavicular joint. Movements that occur at these two translate to being occurring at the scapulothoracic joint. So we'll look through these joints one by one, starting with the sternoclavicular joint. We'll look at the ligaments and features of each joint. So our sternoclavicular joint is between the sternum and the clavicle, as its name would suggest. We have a series of very strong ligaments around this joint because our entire upper limb is suspending from this joint, so it needs a lot of ligaments to hold it together and prevent it from sagging. We have very strong interclavicular ligament running across the superior aspect of the joint and forming the superior aspect of the capsule. We have the inferior edge of the joint capsule, and within the joint we have this articular disc, which helps to improve the range of motion of the joint. Reinforcing this joint inferiorly, we have the costoclavicular ligament, and again it's a very, very strong ligament. It's preventing this medial end of the clavicle from displacing superiorly. We also have a muscle helping to support the joint, and this is the subclavius muscle. So looking at a textbook diagram here, we have our sternoclavicular joint, manubrium of the sternum here, medial end of the clavicle, the interclavicular ligament across the top between the 2 medial ends of the clavicles. We have the anterior sternoclavicular ligament forming the joint capsule anteriorly. We have an articular disc within the joint, and the costoclavicular ligament reinforcing the inferior aspect of the joint. So in terms of classification, the sternoclavicular joint is synovial, and functionally its type is saddle. So we can have movement across 3 different planes occurring at the sternoclavicular joint. Now, it's important to note that the sternoclavicular joint is very incongruent. This means that one articular surface of the joint is much larger than the other articular surface of the joint. In the sternoclavicular joint we have a small articular surface on the sternum and a very large articular surface on the medial end of the clavicle. This means that it will be a relatively unstable joint, which is why we have these really strong ligaments around it to reinforce that joint capsule. As I've mentioned, the sternoclavicular joint is reinforced by that articular disc, which is helping to increase the range of motion, but also to improve the stability of the joint due to its incongruence. So in effect, the sternoclavicular joint, as it's working across all three planes, can be considered as a modified ball and socket joint. Now, in terms of the ligaments, we have anterior and posterior sternoclavicular ligaments forming part of the joint capsule, which reinforces the joint, and these will limit anterior and posterior movements of the medial end of the clavicle. So these will help to limit the degree of protraction and retraction. We have the costoclavicular ligament inferiorly, which helps to limit superior movements of the medial end of the clavicle. So we'll be helping to prevent depression of the sternoclavicular joint. And we have the interclavicular ligament on the superior aspect, helping to prevent excessive elevation. So let's look at these movements in a little bit more detail. Again, we've got the manubrium, a couple of ribs here, and the clavicle. Our first range of motion is protraction and retraction, and this is where the lateral end of the clavicle moves anteriorly and posteriorly. And these are the movements being limited by the anterior and posterior sternoclavicular ligaments. We also have the movements of elevation and depression, which is where the lateral end of the clavicle, and therefore also the scapula, move superiorly and inferiorly. Elevation will be limited by the interclavicular ligament, while depression will be limited by the costoclavicular ligament. And our third plane of motion is anterior and posterior rotation, which is rotation along the shaft of the clavicle. Now, we mainly see the movements of the sternoclavicular joint on the lateral end of the clavicle and the movement of the scapula. And this is because the center of rotation for protraction and retraction and elevation and depression is very close to the medial end of the clavicle. So as these movements are occurring, this center of rotation is effectively staying in the same place. So using elevation as an example, as the clavicle is elevated, this center of rotation doesn't move. However, the lateral end of the clavicle will move superiorly, and the medial end of the clavicle will move inferiorly within its socket. So we end up seeing a high degree of mobility at the lateral end of the clavicle, but we don't really see much movement at the medial end of the clavicle. Now, for further study on the joints of the pectoral girdle, you can refer to your prescribed textbook and to the principles document, as well as to your study guide. This has been Dr. Lloyd White. I hope I'm making sense, and thanks for taking part.